Here's your water, sir. Okay, well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate Jeff and Tom for inviting me. I want to thank Amber and Angela for attending to some of the logistics, and Caroline and Kevin for helping with today's video setup. And if you do something, I'll thank you as well. So this is a talk that I've developed and has evolved over a number of years. When I was an undergraduate student, as many of you are, I was in a seminar and people went around the room and said what they did. And someone said they're a painter, someone said they're a metalsmith. It got to me, I said, I'm a mock archaeologist. Because calling myself a printmaker or ceramicist, which is what I was doing for my thesis, didn't really describe what I'm doing. So in early years, I presented lectures that were surveys of mock archaeology. And then, using many of the same strategies of mock documentation, I began to think more broadly about what disciplines I'm representing and so forth. So I want some of you as students to imagine 35 years from now, you're presenting a lecture on your work, and who will be the influences? If you give a source lecture now, what sort of conceptual framework will you put around your work? So generally I'm regarded at the University of Tennessee as the official trickster on campus. And so the title of this talk is Mock Documentation. The theoretical point of, beginning point for this is Linda Hutchins' book, A Theory of Parody. And in that book, she defines parody as ironic imitation of a specific work, a genre, or a discipline to comment on a canonical aesthetic theory or object text. This is her book from 1985. Most of us are familiar with artworks that are imitation of a specific work. So for example, if you Google Mona Lisa parody, you will get a screenshot that has Osama bin Lisa, and Pinup Lisa, and Mickey Lisa, and all of these kinds of variations. And art about art, parody of art, is a common sort of form of parody in the visual arts. But I think if your target is art, you're shooting too low. So what I'm really interested in is parody of a genre or a whole discipline. And so I look to writers like Jorge Luis Borges in his story Tulum Ukvar Orbis Tertius, in which, in the form of an encyclopedia, where in the story they find one volume of a 40-volume encyclopedia that describes this world called Tulum, everything from its architecture to its playing cards, the dread of its mythologies and the murmur of its languages. Or I look to mock documentary films. You know, there's this whole section in your Netflix queues called mockumentaries. So I look to Woody Allen's movie Zelig, where he assumes this role of this character in the 20th century and inserts this chameleon into different situations. So when he's surrounded by SS officers, he becomes a fascist. At a Mississippi juke joint, his complexion becomes darker and his hair becomes more kinky. You know, when he's, in any given situation, he blends in and becomes part of that culture. And so it's this whole story about this fictitious historical character presented in documentary form. Of course, there's the great film, This is Spinal Tap, which is the mock rockumentary, this imaginary 1980s band in a film called Rob Reiner. And the Spinal Tap in it actually became a band. And Chris Guest, who produced this film, produced things like A Mighty Wind and Best of Show and so forth. And then if you go to Los Angeles, there's the Museum of Jurassic Technology, a fictitious museum devoted to all of these amazing subjects and displays and so forth. It's a real meta museum. And this is not without historical precedent. So the mock documentary has been a political force and reminds us to question systems of authority and belief. H.L. Mencken in 1917 wrote an article called The Neglected Anniversary, in which he bemoans the fact that the 75th anniversary of the introduction of the bathtub to the United States had recently passed a few months before and had gone completely unrecognized. And then he proceeded to tell a history of the bathtub in the United States, in which the first bathtub that was introduced into the White House, and early bathtubs were made of wood and later tin. And people thought that this account of the history of the bathtub in the United States was real. And only later did he acknowledge that it was a fiction. So late in 1843, the Philadelphia Common Council considered an ordinance prohibiting bathing between November 1st and March 15th. And it failed of passage by about 2 votes. During the same year, the legislature of Virginia laid a tax of $30 a year on all bathtubs that might be set up. And in Hartford, Providence, Charleston, and Wilmington, Delaware, special and very heavy water rates were levied upon those who had them, as if bathtubs produced a discourse in public policy on hygiene and other things that bathtubs might lead to, and so forth. It wasn't but a few years ago with Superstorm Sandy that people were taking images from Hollywood films, apocalyptic Hollywood films, and tweeting them around. So this from a film about the rising sea levels, taking on New York, were sent around as if this is what's really happening in New York. Mm-hmm. And with a little bit of Photoshop, people were putting sharks in Brooklyn neighborhood waters, right? So people were, they were thinking these things were real, kind of urban legend sort of things. So I think we're surrounded by a culture in which, the media becomes a kind of tool for information that we may not always question. And of course, with the recent end of the Colbert Report, we have these concepts of truthiness. Here we have someone who's using this slippage between the form of news media and fictions and sort of calling attention. Really, he was doing a lot for helping us to become more savvy in our consumption of information. There are artists, activists like the Yes Men who've used strategies with fake websites and other press releases to comment on Halliburton, on Dow Chemical, and Union Carbide, and so essentially their strategy is to create these fake corporations, present them as if they're real, and use the news media to extend this kind of critique of those representations. There's a Polish artist, Zbigniew Libera, who, when Poland was just entering as part of the coalition of forces in the war in Iraq, he staged these photos in which American military soldiers are perceived by Iraqi women as the kind of heroic saviors. And so he created these fictitious kind of news events to sort of critique this notion of going to Iraq to save the country. In the academic world, for over 50 years, there's been this journal called the Journal of Irreproducible Results. You certainly have it in your library here at Webster. It's now published under the name AIR, the Annals of Irreproducible Research. And what makes science science is its reproducibility, that you can take an experiment and repeat it. So the Journal of Irreproducible Results is like mock science. So they have, this is some of the early issues. This is from 1991, and so there's a whole variety of different articles on burnt food, or this is an article on the genetics of mermaids. This is an article on feline reactions to bearded men. There's an earlier article which is about canine reactions to bearded men that's sort of presented for comparative analysis. This is a proposal to preserve the Grand Canyon by filling it with different kinds of styrofoam chips. So when I taught this pranks class, I would have the students do an annotated bibliography on 3 articles from the Journal of Irreproducible Results. And this is a freshman course. And what is preparing college students better than doing an annotated bibliography on fake scholarship? Because then they'll never look at any scholarship without being more critically aware about considering it. So there are some real interesting and classic historical examples of mock documentation. One is Horace Minor. In 1956, he wrote an article in the American Anthropologist called Body Ritual Among the Nasarima. And he writes, the anthropologist has been so familiar with the diversity of ways in which different peoples behave in similar situations that he's not apt to be surprised by even the most exotic customs. And he goes on to describe how this particular culture has special rooms in every house where they go in and they perform personal grooming rituals. And the opulence of a house is often measured in terms of the number of such ritual centers it possesses. So if you're very affluent, you'll have more of these special grooming rooms in your house. And if you've got a lot of money, you'll put marble on the tiles of this room as opposed to just pottery tile, right? And they would even have 1.5 or 2.5 special rooms in your house. What he's describing, of course, is our fascination with our concern about how we look and the grooming habits of North Americans. So Nasarima is American spelled backwards. So using this kind of idea, the illustrator David Macaulay created Motel of the Mysteries, in which he documents excavations that were conducted in the future of a motel from the 1980s, in which people don't know how to use these special ritual devices and so forth. So there are a number of artists who've used these kinds of strategies in their work. A couple of years ago, there was a retrospective of the work of Clayton Bailey, and Clayton Bailey created the Wonders of the World Museum. And much of his work had to do with his work in California discovering Bigfoot. So in the exhibit here at the Crocker Museum in Sacramento, he sort of lays out a lot of these things he found. He would set these up on beaches and so forth, and he'd be like digging like people would find these things right on the beach. And he had things like, this is the Bigfoot dropping tester device. It's Dr. Gladstone's improved method of finding the Bigfoot dropping. This is the comparative anatomy of the penile bone of Bigfoot with that of the normal human male. And this is how Bigfoot got the name Giganticus erectus robustus, because this triple-jointed bone was capable of making a U-turn. And he speculates that this may be the reason that Bigfoot is so rare. This is one of the fossil tester devices. And this is, of course, the skull of Cyclops. So in the 1980s, there was this Italian graphic designer who also billed himself as an architect, who made this incredible book called Codex Seraphinus. And I saw it when I was an undergraduate. He actually did it in the 70s. And it was like too expensive for a college undergraduate student. But later I bought it on eBay. And it has all of these diagrams. It's like, you know, a one-volume encyclopedia of a whole world. So this is a real reference to Borges. And you can look at pages of this stuff, like this would be, you know, some basic molecular structures or experiments. And then it has all of this gobbledygook writing that you can't quite read. It's kind of like jazz writing. Optics, natural history, so ethnography, and this is a special science called drool writing. So all these are colored pencil drawings that were sort of critiques of these. So he creates this whole world and system of knowledge. So we have study of fish, anthropology, and so forth. So the idea of an encyclopedia has really been an important tool for this kind of world making. Sue Johnson, a Maryland-based artist, has this project called the Alternate Encyclopedia. And so when you enter the exhibit, there's like this weird chair with these bull horns on it, a taxidermy pheasant, and then a painting of this anthropomorphized bird lady, still life set up. And then as you go around the exhibit, there are all of these like old high school pull-down maps, you know, that she's done collages and paintings into. So they look very didactic. They have this kind of educational quality about them. But what is that human figure doing with, you know, pileated woodpecker there, you know? Or why is the chipmunk talking into the brain there, you know? They're like these weird surrealist juxtapositions. But it's using the sort of documentary conventions of, you know, an educational diagram. And then she has a lot of non-silver photos. She sort of merges. I mean, a lot of these projects involve some kind of having skills in graphic design. And so you integrate, you know, either desktop publishing skills and InDesign and so forth into your artistic practice. This is, of course, Anatomy of Pegasus. I know you always wanted to know what the inside of a Pegasus looked like. One of the most amazing projects that I got to spend several days in Ithaca, New York, learning about is Norman Daly's Civilization of Luros. And in the early 1970s, he first presented this. And he was a professor of painting at Cornell University. And I learned about him when I was in graduate school, so I had been making fake cultures for a couple of years at that point. But one of the first things I did when I got to Tennessee is I got a research grant. I asked for a whopping $600 so I could get a plane ticket to spend 10 days with Norman in Ithaca. And I lived in his son's house, which was immediately across the street. And every day I would go with a notepad of paper and we would talk and I would write notes. And then the afternoon I would go back, compile my notes, and bring them back the next day. So we wrote an article about Luros that was published in a journal called Leonardo. What Daly did is he made an entire civilization through 150 different artifacts. Everything from a small pillbox-sized scientific instrument to a 36-foot-long temple wall. And it was presented at a museum before they had the Johnson Museum there. These are some showcase images. And so here we have what is, he was an early user of acrylic paint. We have a ivory soap bottle that's been turned into this fertility oil container. It's then represented in the catalog here as this tray-led oil container. And other objects, you know. So he used the kind of sort of Duchampian ready-made strategy, but he resituated these objects. So this is a nasal flute, for example, and he talks about a Peruvian anthropologist who developed a technique to play a nasal flute, very much like this one. And so there are all these stories. He had interviews with the archaeologists. He had translations of poems. One of my favorite Laurentian poems is the Pilkut love song that goes, "If you want me as I want you, you would let me die under a petal of your rose, and you would bury me in the lobe of your ear." So it's just, it was just an amazing project. Around then, two California-based printmakers, Elmer Rapp and Elmer Bender, created a project that was presented at the DeYoung Museum in San Francisco called Coolio Ruins and Restorations. And they used the same cases that had been used for the Treasure of Tutankhamun show as it traveled across North America in the 70s. And so this is in one of these cases where you can see, you know, coconut bark paper and different objects, artifacts that they discovered. This is a game board, but no one's quite figured out the rules for how to play it. And they presented the material to two archaeologists, one at Berkeley, one at San Francisco State, who knew it was a work of fiction, but they published this preliminary report on excavations at Coolio. One of the, another project in the 80s, there were a lot of these kinds of things that I've documented. In fact, I've had people come to Knoxville, because they have a box full of all this stuff, and different people have, I mean, there's a PhD dissertation in this, so if you want to come to Knoxville, you can study the box of all this correspondence with this, and there's a book here, publishable coffee table book. Bill Willers was a fish scientist at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, but also, what's interesting, when he got tenure, he renegotiated his contract for half pay so that the other semester he could be an artist. Interesting sort of gig. And this is one of the most fascinating things he ever made. He took a human study skeleton from their anatomy lab and a Shetland pony skeleton and made a centaur. And this traveled to different exhibits. And then he wrote to me because a curator had told him about my work and wanted to know if I knew of anyone who would buy the centaur. So I gave a talk back then to a graduate seminar in life sciences, and my colleague was interested in the centaur, and he said, he's looking for someone to buy it. And my colleague said, well, how much does he want for it? I said, he wants $2,000 for it. That seemed like a lot of money to me. And my colleague in the sciences said, okay, let's buy it. It took about $8,000 because I had to go there to a university cargo van and get it. So this is in the back of the van. We had to put lighting over it. We installed it in our library. And now the University of Tennessee is distinguished as having the largest adult male centaur in a university library east of Mississippi. Right? And so we've had panel sessions on Centaurian scholarship and things like that. They recently moved it because they're doing some remodeling. This became an issue, like, are we going to move this anywhere else on campus? There are so many references to this thing in the literature and on the web that they can't take it out of the library now. It's now on the other side over there. Adrienne Mayer, in her book, The First Fossil Hunters, asserts that the ancients in the ancient Greek and Roman world, when they discovered dinosaurs and other paleontological objects, that fueled their ideas of things like griffins and so forth. So, for example, in a mastodon, the tusks usually dissolve and fall away first. And you know, if you see a giant skull like that, you think, oh, this is a cyclops skull. So she applies a kind of science of paleontology to explain ancient mythological creatures. So we had forums on hoaxing in science and teaching in order to generate interest in funding, bringing the centaur to the university. And now it looks like the whole university library is built around the centaur. It perfectly blends in. There's a Canadian artist named Richard Purdy who's done these kind of projects in so many different disciplines. And what's really exciting is as I've done this work over the years, when I was younger, I would write to people, and now people write to me. So I sort of keep compiling information on different people. Purdy, who taught for many years at Trois-Rivières in Quebec, has done so many different projects. If you're interested in his work, you can check it out. There's another guy named Richard Purdy who's an abstract painter. But this Richard Purdy said he wanted to have a two-person, one-name show with the other Richard Purdy. But I don't know if it's ever going to happen. But this is one project called Corpus Christi. And it is an imaginary city designed based on the crucified image of our Lord and Savior. So in the halo is the clergy. In the head is the government. In the left hand is the academy. And in the right hand is the theater where all the arts are practiced. The people are the blood of the city, so they run along the roads and so forth. And every day they go to the Cathedral of the Sacred Heart, located where the heart is. Oops. And so this is a model of that city. Of course, the parks are very airy in the lung area. In an area corresponding with the human liver is where the wine merchants are located. Now, we don't know this for sure because a Vatican librarian erased this part of the plans, but they think the brothels were in the, you know where. The moneylenders and the bankers were in the knees, and the prisons were in the toes, where there was the least circulation. So the body of Christ becomes the civic body, the people are the blood of the city, and unfortunately the city was never constructed because it was considered to be militarily indefensible. But the idea still exists as a kind of, you know, Renaissance integration of humanism and Christianity. He also created this project during Y2K called Inversion of the World. So I think a lot of you were, you know, pretty young when this happened, but there was a lot of panic in the world when we switched from the 20th century to the 21st century, you know? We thought everything was just going to go, you know, bonkers. So there was all this kind of millennial, this kind of, you know, dystopian notion. So he published an atlas. And basically the idea is that everywhere above sea level will go below sea level. Everywhere below sea level will go above sea level. Islands will become lakes. Lakes will become islands. East coasters become west coasters. West coasters become east coasters. So at that fateful night, everyone got a canoe, a dinghy, an air mattress, anticipating this event. And so he maps the whole new world in its, he uses the documentary form of cartography to present this imaginary world. It's kind of like a redo. So the Sea of Cortez becomes a peninsula. Australia becomes an ocean. A New York artist who teaches at Parsons School created the Society for New Universal Harmony. And this is their retreat and study center in upstate New York. And they have an exhibit showing their various therapeutic methods that seem rather bizarre, but they help to align your electromagnetic field and so forth. So, I mean, there's this kind of, quackery sometimes that's involved in medicine, right? Is it an art? Is it a science? So she's documenting these different methods, and she refers to this engraving from the 18th century that shows people who attach ropes to trees and sit so they can feel the energy of the sap going through the trees, and it goes to them and realigns their electromagnetic fields. So she's invented this kind of fake form of medicine with these photographs. It's sort of the history of the different patients and the clinical methods, of course, all consistent with HIPAA disclosure regulations. There's an artist for her MFA thesis at the University of New Mexico who created the Daughters of St. Catherine. And this was presented at a venue in Buffalo, New York, called SEPA. And using photography and graphic design, she presents an imaginary Catholic convent where the pious young women starve themselves for the greater glory of God. So essentially, she's creating this kind of religious anorexia system. And in fact, there are traditions of fasting in order to achieve spiritual awareness and so forth. So she documents this and has, this is presumably the hand of one of these nuns. Cover of an issue of National Geographic. These are the vomit wands that they used in order to curse. There was a couple years ago, there was this thing in the New York Times Book Review about this artist, Shea Hembry, who created a fictitious group exhibition called 100 in 2011, in which he made the artwork of 100 different artists that he presented. So it's like he had a group exhibit, but he made all the different work. So any of you who can't figure out what you want to do, maybe that's the strategy. Instead of trying to figure out what your art is, maybe you should make art by a number of different people and pass it off as those other people. Maybe it's more interesting to be someone else than to be yourself, right? So these are the different works. It's very hard to do that, frankly. I found that I can only do art of about 11 different people myself. So I'll show you some of those projects. So I'm going to buzz through the Hoax Archives here. And the idea of hoax, of course, relates to the word H-O-A-X. And when I was working on my graduate thesis, my roommate, who was a technician in the geology department, said, you should consider calling your thing the Hoax Archives. And I said, well, that seems kind of obvious. He said, not if you spell it H-O-K-E-S. I thought, that's a great idea. So one thing there is someone might have a good idea for you. Don't worry about authorship. If they've got a good idea for you, go for it, right? Because then it's yours. You own it. It's fine, right? Lived up to it. So ever since then, for over 30 years, I've been creating the Hoax Archives. So as you'll see in the show, this involves fabricating and documenting the biography of Everett Ormsby Hoax, who I'll talk about during a walkthrough, during the reception, And so I scour real history to insert, like Woody Allen movie Selig, this kind of fictitious history into it. So here's Hoax with archaeology, medicine, and creative zoology represented by the centaur. And so the Azudian project was the third fictitious civilization I created, located along the Euphrates River, along the Iraqi-Syrian border. And so for this installation, I did a painting of the Inodab Temple. It's called Reconstruction of an Azudian Temple. And so I have a styrofoam facsimile of the temple facade. I have over 30 wheel-thrown ceramics. I have 10 frescoes showing scenes of daily life as well as the gods and goddesses involved in their lives. This is Ninmulam, the goddess of garlic. Garlic figured prominently in their cuisine. This is Lakut, the goddess of bread. And so at the top register, you can see someone tending to the baking with different bread forms, ring bread, cross bread, and so forth. This is Eklam and Tulam, who are the ideal married couple in their mythology. And so whenever young people, anyone would have marital strife, they would make offerings to Eklam and Tulam. And if we had more time, I would read a poem as a tribute to Eklam and Tulam. Then there's prints that look like wonderful. I mean, in the 19th century, lithography was used. I mean, I'm sure that you get a great curricular overview in art history, but there is so much history of culture that art history does not represent. A lot of it's by anonymous artisans, people who did drawings for lithographic book plates and so forth. So this one is in the show, Azudian divination beads. Diagrams of Azudian architecture. And then the ceramics. So it was a lot of fun to make the ceramics, decorate the ceramics.
Are those lithographs or the drawings of lithographs?
No, they're real lithographs. Why? Because...
Sure.
Although Norman Daly did have something he claimed to be a lithograph, which was not. It was actually collage. But yeah, so, you know, sometimes you can't. I mean, you really need to throw the pot and break the pot, right? This is a milk jug, as you can clearly see. And then there would be lithographs documenting pots. This is a vessel with an inverted spout. Only 35 of these we know of in public and private collections. No one exactly knows what they were used for. Then there are portraits of the archaeologists. So you invent a culture, but you also have to invent the scholars who study the culture and their competing theories about the culture. So if you're going to make a world, you have to be totally invested in it. This particular scholar, Charlotte Dallaire, who's based on a portrait, it's like the female alter ego of Charles Baudelaire, and these are based on photographs by Nadar, where I kind of transgendered them. She was able to go into hypnotic trances and complete all the missing sections of these, and a couple of these prints are in here. And so there's that sort of documentary voice. I'm going to say this with authority, mean it, you know, I want to be, you know, I'm standing on solid ground. Okay. So another project is Hoax Medical Art. So I've always been interested in the history of printing that has to do with scientific illustration, and a lot of that stuff was for medicine and anatomy. So with Hoax Medical Arts, I talk about Hoax's collaboration with various hospitals in Germany, France, Italy, Poland, and the United States. Hoax's biography, I'll talk about a little tonight in the text panel, came from England. And so these are prints that document these unusual internal organs. This was for a portfolio on skulls, so it kind of was arranged to look skull-like. I did this one in Germany, in German, in a dissection of an abnormal organ. You're not kidding. Eye surgery. So there was this kind of Dr. Seuss meets Dr. Gray quality of about a lot of these. But I really got into color, so a lot of them have 6 and 7 runs. They get very complex that way. So when I would make artifacts that were fragments of something. With these, oftentimes it says plate 342. So you're to imagine hundreds of other plates in the encyclopedia. So you don't always have to show everything. You can just show a fragment of something that alludes to a larger body of work. Concurrent with working on that, and because I'd been living in the South for over 2 decades at that point, I created the George and Helen Spelman Folk Art Collection. And it was first presented at Carnegie Mellon University. And for this, I created the work of 11 fictitious contemporary self-taught outsider artists. I created George and Helen Spelman. George was an insurance agent for State Farm. Helen was a 3rd grade school teacher. And together they built the most important collection of self-taught art that no one had known about. They were from Lenore City, Tennessee. So it starts out, visiting George and Helen Spelman's modest yellow split-level house in Lenore City, Tennessee is like making a pilgrimage to a sacred temple of American folk art. While their neighbors purchased bass boats, home entertainment systems, recreational vehicles, and patio furniture, the Spelmans were quietly amassing a significant collection of contemporary folk art. And then according to the narrative, they gave it to the Hoax Archives because it was just, they didn't have enough room to store it in there. They didn't want to build an addition to their house. The kids had already left for college and so forth. So this traveled around and included biographical narratives about each of the artists. This is Lucas Farley, Poplar Hill, Virginia, who, after his mother died, turned his entire record collection of mostly R&B and soul records into these artworks because his mother was always critical that he wasn't listening to sacred music. And so when presented, you have 56 records with these painting collages, and then this little biography with his house and a portrait of him. So that's sort of the setup. So Arthur Middleton wanted to be a better father to his sons William and Thomas than his own father was to him. So he involved them in scouting, and they did a project where they did portrait paintings of American presidents, from George Washington to Ronald Reagan. P.J. Hipple received workman's compensation after an engine block fell on his foot at Dobbs Ford in Memphis. And during his 3-month recuperation, he did all of these drawings that were later bought by the Spelmans. I had to have a velvet painter, so Charlotte Black was stood up at the altar by her fiance at the Chapel of Love in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. But her Uncle Bud had bought her 2 tickets to go to Tahiti for a honeymoon package. While in Tahiti, she discovered the work of Edgar Liettig, who's responsible for doing the black velvet paintings that appear in a lot of tiki lounges and so forth in the 50s and 60s. So when she returned to Union Church, Mississippi, she started to do paintings of brides on velvet. She was a cocktail waitress, so there's lots of beer bottle caps adorning the frames. And the man who helped her make the frames, according to the narrative, her name was Charlotte Black. She married Charles White, and they're all these black and white velvet paintings. She no longer does paintings of brides, but she is known for her pet portraits and horse paintings today. Max Pritchard rediscovered movable type and printed New Testament scripture on the back of cereal boxes and cracker boxes. Juanita Richardson painted beer bottles in order to take them out of returnable beer bottles so they wouldn't be used to hold alcoholic beverages because of the history of alcoholism in her family. So this is actually a 12-pack. Lester Coleman Dowdy, who I befriended, is a sort of neighborhood healer in Union Church, Mississippi, and he made lumberjacks. And the lumberjacks are puppets used in healing ceremonies. So if you got a backache or arthritis, he would take this puppet and he'd dance it, and you would heal as a result of that. The first one he made was for his niece Angela, which had a toothache, so he made this little puppet with a tooth. And this is the most popular one. This is Mr. Stop Smoking, so he's got kind of black lung and so forth. So he would dance that puppet and he played a harmonica. So he taught me some of his harmonica riffs, so I want to share those with you. Then there was E.B. Hazard. He made an alien communication device to be reunited with his family. He didn't file tax returns for 2 years and then was brought back to our planet. And then wanted to be reunited with us, so he started making these devices. And then finally, there's the Association for Creative Zoology. And in 2006, there was a Reuters report that most of the Republican candidates for president did not believe in the theory of evolution. And when we had the centaur, I did a talk about how centaurs are examples of how God uses collage to create species diversity, debunking the theory of natural selection. So I went back to that project and thought, God, these presidential candidates, they're my people. I need to make art for them. So based on the centaur and the theory of zoomorphic juncture, which combines, so back then I made these collages, and it was before digital projectors. I made slides of them and gave this brief talk. I went back to those collages and thinking about the great history of zoomorphic juncture, a term which I learned in art history. When an art historian, I think they must, I've never found it in any...
We make up the words.
Yeah, you make up the words. So. But it had, if an art historian makes up a term and it sticks with a freshman, and then the freshman goes on later to apply that term, it's knowledge. It's called creating new knowledge. So you go to Belvedere Garden, you see the Sphinx. And so Tennessee, of course, has this great history of the battleground of creationists and evolutionists. And so my first place I displayed this was at the Scopes Trial Festival in Dayton, Tennessee. And it was here that I set up this kiosk with some of the first prints from and in the distance here is Williams Jennings Bryan, who established Bryan College, which has a science-based curriculum that uses creationist principles, young Earth creationist principles. So I later took this at the invitation of the American Museum, the Museum of the Philosophical Society of America in Philadelphia, just like the Liberty Bells, like right over there, where I set it up. This is in the Thomas Jefferson Garden. And so I would dress as the Reverend James Randolph Denton, sharing the gospel of creative zoology. And if you go to YouTube and you search my name, you can find some of the videos of me doing these kinds of things. I propose that a statue should be built in Central Park in honor of the Reverend Denton, who in the 1920s went to the Scopes Trial Festival and traveled all over the American South and Midwest. I'm sure he came to St. Louis, promoting creationism. And this may explain why so many Americans today still do not believe in the theory of evolution, because of the good work that the association was doing back in the early 20th century. And so the duck-billed platypus, of course, is clear evidence of juncture. And so this is the Microteris trichopolaris. The Microteris is in the bass family. Trichopolaris. I'm sure you all study Latin. That's how you got into Webster. Tricho is Latin for hair. Pilaris for ball. So this is the bass of hairball. This is the Colivare jeremy, the giraffe snake. And these are Trichopiscidae, hairy fish, for example. Do you know which of these is not kosher to eat? Someone suggested I should plan a creative zoology cookbook. This was the groundhog fish that was caught by Lester Morgan along the... So most people think hairy fish come from cold waters, but it's not true. You can probably find them right in the Mississippi. And this is the Georgia dogfish of Lake Lanier. And so I tried to make some species by ordering fake animal things on eBay, but they're not as convincing. So then I sent a letter out to 8 taxidermists, because I'm not going to do this, folks. Some things you can outsource. And no one wrote back, because they probably thought I was nuts. So then I started making phone calls, and this one taxidermist said, Terry, Allred Taxidermy, he might be interested in this. They call these novelty mounts. So I went to Terry and I showed him some images, what I was thinking of. He did beautiful work. I gave him $300 cash. I said, why don't we do, I think we did the fish mount first. And then, 3 months later, he calls, says, your fish is ready. And he's like, he's gonna have, I think he waited to call because people kept coming to the shop saying, whoa, look at that. So I did a residency in Belgium where the director of the studio said, the zoo here has some litho stones that haven't been printed that show creative zoology. That's what they claim according to the narrative. So I made these Flemish versions of the Mensop steer. The Mensop, like monkey, means man ape. Mensop, steer, of course, cow. This is the Fox Aran, or fox eagle. And then I have a set of 9 prints, ornithological quadrupeds by the Reverend James Randolph Denton, lithographed in 4 colors by Everett Ormsby Hoax. Of course, this is 5 runs. Don't believe what you read. So I have a variety of these. The Burmese lionhawk, the long-tailed marmot heron, the American badger swallow, which is in the show, I believe. And then finally, I want to conclude with the bull raccoon, the Taurus crocitensis. This was discovered in Tennessee, so I have fossil evidence of the bull raccoon. Because people would always say, do you have fossil evidence? And I said, oh, sure, I got fossil evidence. And I'm thinking, oh, God, I need big fossil evidence. And so this is a print showing the bull raccoon in its native habitat before the Great Global Flood. So it perished in the Great Deluge. And later this month, I have a show of this work in Murfreesboro, and our legislature's in session. So I'm going to the state capitol, and I'm lobbying to have the bull raccoon designated as an official antediluvian animal in the state. No state has an official antediluvian animal. But I'd like some college to change its mascot so that they have the bull raccoons, the fighting bull raccoons. And the one I really like would be the lady bull raccoon. Right? And then, you got these, imagine thousands of sports fans. I love the Packers, but I think this is better than a cheesehead, don't you? And so, we got swag, so you can buy t-shirts and stuff like that. And let me end with Ben Shahn from The Shape of Content. So you're studying art in a university setting. So think about this. As an intellectual center, the university can provide background and stimulation to the artist. It can broaden him as an individual. It can conceivably provide a new direction for art. All this if one accepts the thesis that art is an intellectual as well as emotional process, and that it thus profits by an expanded range of knowledge and experience. 1957. Thank you.